But before we get into the nitty-gritty of Britain's secret defences, I want to start by talking about how this book came about. How did you first get interested in this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I did a history degree, and I thought I had a good understanding about Britain in 1940 and the defences we had in place. And then I read a book by a guy called David Lamp called Last Ditch, which was published in 1968. And Last Ditch is the first book that's been published about the auxiliary units in the Special Duties Branch. And at the time, so all these guys all signed the Official Secrets Act. This book was published in 1968. It came out, and they were furious that that this book, an American, David Lamp, had written about them. But suddenly my head was turned. Suddenly I realised, actually, we weren't relying on Corporal Jones with a pitchfork. Actually, we were highly prepared. We were going to be utterly ruthless in the execution of our defence, and it completely turned my head as it would do. And who doesn't love a secret bunker? So we at the time, CART, the Coleshill Auxiliary Research Team, had just been set up. I volunteered my services as a press officer because I'm a PR man, and it went from there. And over the 13 years or so that I've been involved, the more information has come out, the more bunkers that we find, the few veterans that are remaining tell us more. It's just I think the most incredible story that kind of turns on its head the general narrative that's built up since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, that kind of dad's army image. Let's get on to, for the uninitiated, get on to the auxiliary units that you've mentioned. One of the striking things for me was that this started quite a long time before the Second World War.
Yeah, and this kind of goes against that narrative again, that we have this perception of Britain being a kind of unprepared against invasion, but actually as early as 1938, SIS or MI6 was setting up Section D, which was there to find alternative ways of fighting an enemy. They were sending agents to like Czechoslovakia and France and Belgium and the countries surrounding Nazi Germany to help with propaganda, to help with pre-prepared resistance, to help with information gathering, and really prepared. The guy in charge was a chap called Lawrence Grand, who was a Royal Engineer, a maverick. I would say not ideal for MI6 because he's quite gobby. He talks a lot about what he was up to. But he was in charge of this, and they were basically preparing the countries around Germany for invasion. So even at that point, Britain had already started thinking about other countries, and obviously, pretty quickly, it became apparent that it wasn't other countries that needed help from invasion, but actually Britain. So Grand came back to Britain, and he had set something up called the Home Defence Scheme, which is essentially what they were doing in mainland Europe, but in Britain. And Grand, in his maverick way, was going around arming civilians with huge amounts of explosives and weapons, and planting explosives under bridges and dockyards without telling anyone, leaving caches of weapons everywhere. But that thought had already occurred, and he was starting to build up. By the end of June 1940, 1,000 civilians in the kind of key invasion areas, so that kind of southeastern corner and the south of England. So 1,000 civilians had already been recruited in various roles, and it was a huge effort. So that was the kind of the one area where the auxiliary units came from. Like all this stuff, it's a bit more complicated than that, because at the same time, Lieutenant General Andrew Thorne was commanding 12 Corps in that southeastern corner, and Eden came down to see how things were going. There were no tanks, there were no anti-tank guns. Thorne was understandably a bit upset about this. So Eden arranged a lunch with Churchill, having lunch, and Thorne was military attaché in Berlin during the 30s. And he got to learn about the German peasantry militia. And part of the irony of the auxiliary units is that it was that part of it came from Germany. So Thorne got to learn about the German peasantry militia. These groups have been about since the 1700s, something like that. And they'd basically, on their master's land, they would gather weapons, keep them hidden, and if an invading army would come in, they'd grab their weapons and attack this invading army. And what they lacked in numbers, they had superiority in terms of knowledge of the land and where key points were and things like that. So Thorne thought, actually, this might be a really good way of taking on a German invasion of Britain if they'd attempted Operation Sea Lion. And so he spoke to Churchill. Obviously, Churchill loved it. I mean, this is that perfect Churchill material, arming civilians, highly secret, absolutely right up his alley. So he quickly got in touch with military intelligence research, which was run by a chap called Joe Holland, another Royal Engineer. And Joe had the perfect chap in mind to start these kind of prototype guerrilla forces. And that guy was Peter Fleming, who's the brother of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. And Peter, at the time, was much better known. He'd travelled the jungles of Brazil looking for a lost explorer. He actually worked for SIS in China, and was a real believer in guerrilla warfare. So he's the perfect chap to start these prototypes. And he started it in Kent, in a house called the Garth. And he started to gather civilians, mainly in reserved occupations, so farmers or farm workers, estate workers, gamekeepers, people like that, people who knew their local area intimately, could probably handle a gun, and began to train them in guerrilla warfare and sabotage. And as a result of the Churchill's influence, he had a lot of explosives, and there's stories of people going to the Garth's house and there'd be a roaring open fire and there'd be boxes of explosives everywhere, like a health and safety nightmare. And but they started to train these guys in terms of the sabotage and guerrilla warfare, how they could take the German army not front on but from behind, come out and attack the supply chain. And so they had these two groups doing very similar things. And eventually Ironside, who was head of GHQ Home Forces, got to learn about Grand and his slightly maverick arming of civilians without giving them any training about how to handle explosives or guns, and decided, actually, we need to bring this to the military side quickly. And so he combined the two. So Peter Fleming's lot, which were called 12 Corps Observation Corps, and the Home Defence Scheme kind of merged into one. Sorry, I've rambled on.
No, this is great. This is great. And it just gives you that sense that there's lots of people with similar ideas, and it's just about bringing them together. And there's a kind of military element as well, isn't there? Units like the Lovat Scouts, they're kind of ghillie suit guys, and the independent companies, of course, operating early on in the war. And so how important was that kind of military influence on this? Is it kind of properly organised?
Massively, because once it became under the military control, it became very apparent that this was going to be an anti-invasion force. Under Grand and HDS, it was a bit vague, as you might expect. Just carry on blowing up stuff for as long as you can. But when it came under Ironside and later Gubbins, it was very much, this is an anti-invasion force. You've got a set amount of time to do as much damage as you possibly can to the invading army. And that's your lot. We'll probably talk about it later. But they had the auxiliary units had 2 weeks' rations, and that was their life expectancy once the Germans had entered their area. So absolutely critical was the military organisation, because otherwise it would have just been chaos, frankly. And bringing it together was, as I mentioned, Colonel Gubbins, who had fought with the independent companies in Norway, had led the independent companies in Norway, had fought in India, had fought in the Allied intervention during the Russian Revolution, had fought importantly in Ireland during the Irish conflict. So had a real understanding of the effectiveness, again, of guerrilla warfare and alternative ways of fighting an enemy. And it goes against that perception we have of the British Army. This isn't kind of set-piece battles. This is dirty guerrilla fighting. So Gubbins had a real kind of grasp on that. He'd written 2 or 3 pamphlets during the late 30s on guerrilla warfare. So his job was to extend these units the length of the country and to the south to all those kind of vulnerable counties. So in the end, the auxiliary units were from the Orkneys all the way down the east coast of Scotland, northeast England, southeast Cornwall, southwest, and South Wales. And we think, they all signed this Official Secrets Act, so it's a little hard to judge. We think there's about 6,500 men recruited purely to the auxiliary units in across the war. So
it's amazing number of people, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the other thing I was sort of struck by reading the book was the training and the preparedness and how ruthless they were, kind of explicitly talking about how ruthless it needs to be. And if you had to pick one kind of weapon that would define them, apart from huge amounts of explosives, it's probably the Fairbairn Sykes knife.
Yeah.
That seemed to be, almost epitomise how down and dirty, up close the fighting would be.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And that they had, access to huge amounts of explosives, and they were the first group to be given the Thompson submachine gun before the Home Guard, before in some cases the regular army. So they were prioritised. Gubbins had to send Ironside and Churchill notes, giving them updates on how progress was going. And on one of the notes in the archives, Churchill scribbled, "All these men must have revolvers." So at a point where the LDV were struggling to get hold of any weapons, all the auxiliary unit members were given revolvers. So yes, absolutely, they were given lots of explosives and guns, but you're right, that their main weapons were silent weapons, because their role was to get into the thing they needed to blow up, to get into the thing they needed to disrupt the most and get away. They only had 2 weeks. Anything that was shorten that amount of time would be no good to them. So they didn't want to get into a running battle with the German army. So the Fairbairn Sykes was incredibly useful, and ruthlessness is key to everything that they're up to. So there's a guy still alive in Cornwall. He's 96, 97. Ken Welch. He's part of the patrol in Cornwall. He joined his father's patrol because he followed him one night. So his father had to get him into the patrol, or add him to a list to be assassinated. So brought his child in rather nicely. But the first people that Ken's patrol would have to assassinate as the Germans entered their area was an elderly couple in a cottage overlooking their operational base, their secret bunker, because the elderly couple had seen the bunker being built. If the Germans had got hold of the elderly couple, they'd quite easily seen something's going on down there. So the first people, they had to draw straws. The first people this patrol would have assassinated was this elderly couple. And likewise, throughout all the training these guys were given, everything was on time. So anything that was going to reduce time, they had to get rid of. So if you're out on a mission, on a patrol, one of your comrades is injured in blowing up an airfield or whatever it might be, and you can't get him back to the bunker, you have to kill that patrol member, because again, you can't let them get into the hands of the enemy. And the recruitment of the patrols meant that there was an intelligence officer that was sent out the length of the country. They were sent out to counties where they had a particular affiliation with. They would go to a county, and there they would pick a key area, so near a key road or railway or manor house that might be taken as a German HQ, and they would find a key man, as they would call it, so a farmer or a estate worker or a gamekeeper, someone who had a bit of say in the local village or town, say, sign the Official Secrets Act, now you're part of the auxiliary units, you need to recruit your own patrol. So the patrol leader would then recruit his own patrol, and because of the secrecy behind it, it would all be relatives or colleagues or sons or people that they knew and loved. So suddenly this thing of if Ken got injured in a patrol, his father would be obligated to shoot his own son in order for the patrol to carry on another night or another 2 nights, whatever it might be. So ruthlessness was at the core of what we do, and again goes against that narrative of nice Britain, Corporal Jones. Yeah.
And the secrecy as well. And there's some great images in the book, but one of them that really amused me was the calendar 1938 and the Countryman's Diary, these kind of fake books that when you open them, it's full of pictures of garrots being tied up to trees to decapitate German motorcyclists. This kind of pretty gruesome stuff, hidden away almost.
Yeah, and they were designed exactly for that, to hide in plain sight. So, so prior to invasion, they could be there and your wife or children or relatives wouldn't take any notice of them. Literally, it's just a plain 1937 calendar or a Countryman's Diary. But inside, as you say, just the most horrific techniques of how to decapitate someone or where to place explosives on tanks or bombs. And it's the most remarkable. And it really highlights the ingenuity behind the auxiliary units particularly. The level of thinking was really deep in terms of how to keep it a secret. And each patrol, as I said, 6,500 men, the length of the country. Patrols could be kind of 5 to 6 miles apart, but no patrol knew where the other patrol was at all. So they had no idea where each other were, because that would, you're protecting a cell network. In modern terms, it's basically a terrorist cell. That's how the Germans would have seen it, a terrorist cell. You didn't want each cell communicating with each other, so they were isolated. And once the Germans came, there'd be no communication from outside. There'd be no orders coming in. It would be up to the patrol leader and the patrol. They would have a preset list of targets, but after that list was gone, then it'd be up to them to pick targets as and when they could. And they were encouraged. They were ordered to go out every night. Every night they would have to go out because they had such a short amount of time in terms of their life expectancy. They were hugely isolated as well.
So we've talked a bit about the people. Let's talk now a bit about the places, the thing that got you passionate about this to begin with. The bunkers, the landscapes, the operational bases that were established. And tell us a bit about that. What kind of infrastructure was in place?
It's just incredible. I can't tell you how incredible it is. It's pretty early on, Fleming decided, actually, we need somewhere to stay once the Germans invaded. They can't go blow up something, assassinate a German officer, assassinate a British collaborator, and go home, because that's just not going to work. We need somewhere where they can hide. So the idea of a kind of hideaway, as they were described as first, came pretty early on. And over time, they decided hideaway was a bit negative, so they changed them to operational bases. And they were dug initially by the patrols themselves, but unless you had a very kind of specific set of skills within your patrol, digging and living underground is pretty difficult, like breathing underground is pretty difficult. So there's a few, most patrols were fainting in their underground bunkers to start with, until they brought in the Royal Engineers to build them. And they're just the most remarkable thing. They're like, we're taken to them now, and if they're still intact, we have to be taken to the exact point where they are, because you could be walking around a copse or a forest for weeks without finding these things, because essentially it's a hatch flush to the ground, with debris on top, and you can open the hatch in various ways. So some would be you'd pull what looks like a tree root, and that rings a bell in the bunker, or you have a specific coloured marble. Each member of the patrol was given a specific coloured marble, and you roll it down what looks like a rabbit hole, and it would roll down into the bunker, so the guys could open it from underneath. Or it could be a counterweight system, so you'd stamp on the hatch, and the hatch would automatically lift up and swivel round. So once you're in there, there's a ladder going down into the bunker. You're faced by a blast wall, just in case the Germans found your place and dropped a grenade down. Round the blast wall, and then you're into the main chamber. That's living quarters. So there's enough bunks for most of the men, a table, that's about it. And then some kind of horrific Elson chemical toilets, which would be pretty grim after 2 weeks. And then an escape tunnel out the back, which came out usually near water. It was often disguised, often as a badger set. So the escape tunnel would come out was like a badger set, or in the middle of a wall. The wall would roll away, and you could get out, usually near a water source, to aid your getaway. But essentially, it was morale more than anything, because if the Germans had found you, you'd pretty much done for. But they're just the most remarkable thing, and they're on our doorstep. I mean, they're the whole length of the country. They're where we live. Particularly in a coastal county, and we're still finding them today. We just found one in Wales that on the chap found it, and he put his mobile phone, was taking pictures, and sent them to us. And there's just sticky bombs just all over the floor. Oh. Yeah. So yeah, and most of them haven't been disturbed. Those that are intact, because no one knows about them. Those that were disturbed, we usually a cow falling through them in the 60s or 70s because it rusted through, or a tractor driven over them, or something like that. But those that remain intact are fully intact with bunk. There's one that's been found in Scotland with bunks still up, and the table and the water tank and everything like that. It's incredible.
It's incredible. So what's the process that happens? Say I'm out for a walk, and I
fall
see
down.
a cow, or see a cow fall down, or whatever. Tell us about the process of the organisation. How do they find out about these things? What happens next after that? Presumably calling the bomb squad at certain
Bomb squad's pretty high on the list. We've got a vague idea of where each patrol was. So we have a vague idea where the operational bases might be in a kind of 10, 15 mile radius. So when someone contacts us and says, I found a weird Anderson shelter in the middle of a wood, we're pretty certain that's probably going to be the operational base. So we go up, check it out, and then, like the Wales one, call the bomb squad immediately. And we have, and it's not only operational bases where we have to call the bomb squad. We have emails and phone calls all the time from relatives who are clearing out Grandad's garage, and they send us some pictures of some seeping thing out of the box, and we're like, yeah, you need to get the bomb squad in there now because that's not safe. But the secrecy is he's kept it in there the whole time, not told anyone. In fact, there's let me tell you. So this gives you a really good idea about the secrecy, but also the amount of stuff they had hold of. So this was is a chap called Reg Sinnett was the group commander in Essex, and in the 1970s he phoned the police and said, I've got one or two things left over from the war that I expected to be picked up by the army. Can you come and get them for me? So the police came along and they said, yeah, we're going to have to get the army involved, because they found in his shed 14,738 rounds of ammunition, 1,205 pounds of explosives, 3,742 feet of delayed action fuse, 938 feet of safety fuse, 144 time pencils, 1,207 long delay switches, 1,272 detonators, 719 booby trap switches, 314 paraffin bombs, 131 fog signals, 121 smoke bombs, 36 slabs of gun cotton, and 33 booby traps made up with explosives. And that was the spares.
Wow.
From Essex.
I think there's a program called Britain's Greatest Hoarder. I think we might have found a new candidate. But so, in a way, these are kind of amazing time capsules, aren't they?
Yeah.
If you find one that's intact with all the kit in it, I mean, apart from the weaponry and the bombs, the explosives, all of this stuff, presumably there were other bits and pieces that they were issued with, medical kits, bits of clothing. Yeah. How much support were they given in that sense?
They were given some support. The medical kits were mainly for morphine to administer death, essentially. They were given enough morphine to help your patrol member to slide away easily. They were given later on the war as the threat of invasion diminished and the regular army tried to take more control of them. They were given uniform, which they didn't like, and there was some kind of square bashing training, which they didn't like at all. And they were given uniform, but they were given Home Guard uniform to help with their cover. So throughout the war, right until stand down in November 44, most of them said they were a special Home Guard or something of that matter. So they were given the local Home Guard badge, but it was 202, 203, or 201 was their number. But yeah, so they were given some stuff, and they were given huge amounts of weapons and explosives. But most of it was based. They were trusted a lot, and they were trained to a really high standard, and they were basically trusted to make their own decisions. So they were afforded some equipment, or a lot of equipment, but in terms of kind of everyday tuition, as it were, once the Germans invaded, they were trusted absolutely 100% to act on their own. So they were supported, but once the Germans were there, they were not supported, but trusted to make the right decisions.
And obviously, as the war goes on, gets less and less concern about invasion. November 1944, the scheme is effectively kind of wound up. But many of these people who were serving in the auxiliary units did go on, didn't they, to serve either in SOE or in the SAS, other kind of more formal military roles.
Yeah, and they're perfect for it, because from July 1940, they were being trained in exactly what the SAS and SOE needed. And actually, that's where a lot of the guys over the years that we've spoken to said, well, we didn't do anything, we weren't called upon. But actually, the role that they played was crucial, because they were experimenting with the stuff that was going to go on to be hugely successful for SOE, for the SAS, in time pencils and explosives and where to place them and silent killing and all that kind of stuff. So, and they kind of bent the rules, which the regular army disliked intensely, but actually was hugely useful for the SAS. And you're right, lots of, I think we worked it out to be like 50 or 60 auxiliaries went on to join SAS and SOE. Quite a few died in kind of Operation Ball Basket, those types of operations. But they were, hugely useful for those types of organisations. And Gubbins went on to lead SOE, so he knew exactly what he was getting. And actually, just before D-Day, as the Aux units were slowly being kind of wrapped up in kind of May 44, the SAS held a recruitment of auxiliaries and invited them to a cinema in London to a film about the SAS. Basically said, if you want to leave, that's fine, stand up and you can go now. And obviously no one left. And they recruited everyone there. So yeah, 50 or 60 just joined up.
So we've talked about people who are effectively officially sanctioned. They're given all the explosives, they're given a structure and all of that stuff. But there were people, weren't there, who weren't officially sanctioned, who were kind of doing it off the books. And the phrase that really struck me from the book was, this is a cad's war. This idea that actually you should be doing what you can, whether they're officially sanctioning you or not.
Yeah.
So how much of a help were these kind of off-the-book guerrillas, and how much were they a hindrance to what was going on formally?
So it's really interesting. So the idea of a guerrilla force taking on a invading army from behind the lines is a good one. It's a good idea. So you had the auxiliary units kind of officially in place, the length of the country. But then obviously home guard units, regular home guard units, were thinking, well, actually, why don't we create our own guerrilla sections? That's a really good idea. And they were taking kind of the younger men. There's even an episode of Dad's Army where they talk about this. One of the training majors is saying he wants to create a guerrilla section of the younger members of the Home Guard. And Pike is invited to join, but unfortunately he can't find his way to the headquarters. But it was very much that. And I would say certainly the auxiliary units. We've got letters from auxiliary unit members to GHQ Home Forces saying, you've got to shut this down because they are creating chaos. Because they were very keen, but they weren't trained to anywhere near the standard of the auxiliary units. And not only would they have got in the way during the invasion, but actually they were a security risk, because if they're finding where they're patrolling the same areas of the auxiliary patrols, then it's a whole new lot of names on the list that the auxiliary units are going to have to get rid of when the Germans arrive. So yeah, I talk about it in the book, but I think it's a good idea, but frankly, it would have been a disaster.
And there were civilians too, weren't there? There were kind of anti-invasion duties, the special duties branch. How important were those kind of more civilian elements of the anti-invasion?
Yeah, and these are remarkable civilians, because these aren't. So the auxiliary units tended to be like young men in reserved occupations, kind of 35, 40-year-old farmers, like fit young men who would otherwise have joined up. Special duties branch was made up of the elderly and mothers and teenagers and vicars and doctors. These guys had a role where, as the German army came through their town or village, they were highly trained in recognizing units and insignia and counting numbers and direction of travel and weapons and equipment, all that stuff. And they could stand on the street without getting attention from the Germans. If you're a grandmother or if you're a mother pushing a pram, the German army probably isn't going to pay you a lot of attention. If you're a 35-year-old father staring at the German army, they're probably going to have a look at you. So these guys, again, were trained. Again, it came out of Home Defence Scheme with Grand, and these were the information gathering people. So this was really to stop what happened in France and Germany, France and the Low Countries with the Blitzkrieg. So where the German army would just appear in a town or village and they'd go through, the civilians would flee onto the road, understandably. But there's no one there to tell anyone in any command as to where the Germans were going, how many there were, to allow local command or GHQ to make informed decisions about counterattack. So these guys were there for that exact purpose. So they would see the German army come through. They would write it down on a piece of edible paper, which was apparently pretty grim, and then they would leave it at a dead letter drop. So lots of examples of dead letter drops throughout the country. Everything from a fake tree stump with a revolving top, where you'd put the message in a split tennis ball, and you'd put it in the tree stump, and it'd roll down to the next dead letter drop, and the next person would pick it up. Or a gate post where there was a horseshoe on the gate post. It was facing up. There was no message. It was facing down. There's a fake gate bolt you'd pull out, and the message is in there. Or even just an OXO cube tin left on a windowsill. Anything you can do in plain sight. That would then be passed on through various runners until it reached a civilian wireless operator. And the wireless operators were usually, again, called key men, so people like vicars or doctors or publicans, people who had a certain authority within their town or village, and they would hide their wireless sets usually in the place where they worked. So a vicar would have it in a pulpit, or a publican would have it in the roof in the pub, or a doctor would have it in his surgery. There's a really good example on the Devon-Dorset border of a wireless set in a bunker underneath an outside toilet. So you go in the outside toilet, open it up, looks like a normal outside toilet. Go back outside, there's a little kind of water meter hatch on the floor, you open that up and there's a lever in there which you turn 90 degrees, go back, and that allows you, that's a release mechanism that allows you to lift up the whole of the toilet system. Once your toilet system's up there, there's a ladder going down. You go down the ladder into what looks like a Anderson shelter, for some reason really weirdly disguised. Even then, if the Germans had got that far, they wouldn't really know what's going on until you pull a clothes hook on a shelf. That releases another release mechanism that opens up a false wall, which then reveals where the wireless set was hidden. And on the outside of the house, around the boundary of the house, was a hedge. And in the middle of the hedge was one of these false tree stumps with a revolving top. The last runner in the line of this particular section would put the message in the tennis ball, put it in the tree stump. That would roll all the way down into the bunker, right next to where the wireless operator was sitting. So again, levels of ingenuity were incredible. And again, this stuff is all on our doorsteps, and no one knows about it.
It's incredible. I mean, not just ingenuity, the level of engineering, cooperation, all of that stuff. We should just say, I mean, we touched there, key men. There were women involved in this as well, weren't there? And actually, you dedicate an entire chapter of the book to the role of particularly ATS personnel. They
had a hugely important role, particularly in the Special Duties branch. They weren't involved in the auxiliary units, but they were because it was military control, and we'll go into Section 7 later. But the Special Duties branch relied massively on women because, one, as I said, they weren't going to be suspicious to an invading German army as they were walking through their town or village. And secondly, as you said, the civilian wireless operators would be passing this information on quickly to ATS girls in secret bunkers, very much like the auxiliary units were in themselves. And the ATS girls had a life expectancy, again, of kind of 2 to 3 weeks. Once the Germans had invaded their area, they were expected to go into their bunker and stay there until either the Germans had discovered them or they'd been relieved by the British Army. They were all given cyanide pills. If the German had discovered their bunker, they were given very strict instructions to destroy the radio sets, to burn all paperwork, take as many Germans out as you can, and then crunch down on your cyanide pills. Again, there are kind of, as far as we know, kind of 80 ATS girls are linked for the country. Again, they all signed the Official Secrets Act. We have, very little information about them. But they played an utterly crucial role had the Germans come, because, as I said, getting the information of where the Germans are to the GHQ, to local command, very, very quickly via runner and wireless set could make all the difference in terms of where to allow them to make informed decisions about where to place British troops for counterattack. And it made a massive difference. And the levels of secrecy is mad again, because they were all signed Official Secrets Act. I'd say 80% of Special Duties branch people went to the grave without telling anyone. But even at the time, even though they're in the exact same counties, the auxiliary units didn't know about the Special Duties branch. Special Duties branch didn't know about the auxiliary units, with one exception, one brilliant exception, where a auxiliar is on patrol in his local area. He finds a hatch of a bunker, which he recognises very similar to his, but way too close to his bunker to be another patrol. It's a bit suspicious, finds a way in, goes down the ladder, and at the bottom of the ladder, waiting for him, is an ATS girl pointing a revolver at his head. All she knows is this heavily armed guy in denims has found her bunker and has entered her bunker. All he knows is this woman seems to be using wireless to send information. They agree not to kill each other. And thank God they did, because they later got married. Later got married, had a kid. I mean, that's a way to meet someone in wartime, isn't it?
That's a story.
Online dating's rubbish, that.
Yeah, it beats Tinder, or whatever the kids are using these days. Well, look, we've talked so far about the kind of anti-invasion, the first 2 weeks, that kind of key moment. But there were plans in place to resist occupation in the long term. And you mentioned it already. This is Section 7. This is where you end the book, and again, for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. Tell us about this very little known aspect of the British plans.
This is incredible. Section 7, so at CARTS, we get a lot of information through from people saying, my granddad was definitely in the auxiliary units. He got this training, he used these weapons, this is what he said. And usually you have to take it with a pinch of salt. And for years and years, we were getting information through from lots and lots of people saying, my granddad was definitely in the auxiliary units. But we know the areas the auxiliary units were in. So it's mainly the coastal counties, apart from Herefordshire and Worcestershire. And people were contacting us from Leicester and from Liverpool and from the Midlands. And we were like, well, no, they're not in the auxiliary units. We don't know what they were in, not sure what's going on. And then the official history of MI6 came out by Keith Jeffrey in 2010, 2011, something like that. And there was a paragraph about that big where it talks about Section 7. Section 7 was created by SIS, MI6, as a post-occupation, pre-prepared resistance in the event of Britain being defeated militarily. And they recruited potentially thousands of civilians all over the country. So initially they did a test where they did 6 counties, mainly on that kind of, again, those vulnerable counties to invasion in June 1940, but then it extended the entire length of the country. And these, again, are small cells of civilian volunteers, all signed the Official Secrets Act. The difference between these guys and the auxiliary units and the Special Duties Branch is that this is very much a resistance cell. So it's both the auxiliary units and the special duties combined into one cell. The other difference is that they were training women in combat roles. So we've got evidence that teenage girls were being taught how to use the garrote against German officers, so attracting a German officer into a alleyway or a forest and then garroting him. We've got we hardly know anyone that was in this. We know it definitely existed. We know there was potentially thousands of people involved, but they all signed the Official Secrets Act, so most of them went to the grave without saying anything. There's a great example of a lady who contacted me, whose mother, Irene Lockley, was just on the outskirts of Leeds, really quiet, wouldn't say boo to a goose type of northern lady, and near her, just a couple of weeks before she died, over an aperitif, she told her daughter, actually, during the war, I was involved in a guerrilla warfare with my dad and my uncle and my 2 cousins. So they was a family group. And she was like, okay. And she went into detail. They had a bunker in a cave just on the outskirts of Leeds. She was taught how to garrote German officers. She was taught how to use explosives on railways. She was taught how to blow up factories. She was taught how to assassinate German officers and British collaborators. And then suddenly her daughter got thinking back to the kind of 1950s when she was a small girl, and suddenly stuff started to make sense. She remembers one incident in about 1955, something like that. A pots and pan salesman had come to their door. He was quite aggressive in his sales technique. Her mother kept saying, no, I'm not interested. He put his foot in the door to stop her closing the door. The next thing she remembers as a small girl is the pots and pan salesman sailing through the air, landing in the garden, pots and pans everywhere, because her mother had used some kind of unarmed combat move on this chap, sent him flying across the garden. And suddenly all this stuff started to make sense, that actually her quiet, polite mother was actually something else that she'd only told her a couple of weeks before she died. And there's other examples of a chap called Peter Atwater who was in Matlock in Derbyshire. He was 14 when he was recruited into Section 7. He was going to be an observer, a runner, and he was telling us things like they had a radio. So really interestingly, Section 7 was going to be post-occupation, so this is against the occupying forces. Unlike the Special Duties Branch, whose radio sets were in set locations and very easily discoverable, very quickly discoverable, they were able to move their sets much more like the French Resistance, much more like SOE, where you could grab your radio set in a case and get out and keep going. So his was in the back of a draper's shop. There was a grenade underneath the table with a piece of rope connected to the pin, so you could pull back quickly and jump out if the Germans have found you. There were 2 women radio operators. He was in charge of, as I said, he was an ARP messenger, so he used that as his cover, so he'd able to train going around the town without anyone seeing what he's up to. He was also in the ATC, so he was learning about wireless operation and also firing weapons. He also, interestingly, had to find a suitable bolt hole for enemies of the occupation. So he found a local stable where people who were under suspicion or wanted for arrest by the Gestapo or the German occupying forces, he could grab them, take them to the stable, and then move them up a line of people to escape either to the unoccupied zone, which we presumed it would be a bit like France. So there'd be a kind of line across the Midlands, or slightly higher, where there'd be an occupied zone of Britain and an unoccupied zone, so you could try and get them out there. The wireless sets were used. So part of Section 7, there was a chap who had headed up Section 8 of SIS, which was all about communication. And the wireless sets they had were capable of communicating either to the unoccupied zone or to Canada, where a government in exile could be kept up to date with what the occupying forces were doing. And this was all done by kind of 1941. Since the auxiliary units has become a bit better known, they've been called the British Resistance. They weren't the British Resistance. They were a highly trained suicidal squad of anti-invasion forces. Section 7 was the anti-occupation force. They were there for as long as they could, and who knows what the success looked for them, because the French resistance always had the hope that that we were free, and we were essentially an aircraft carrier for US forces and us to take the fight back. But if we'd fallen, how long would Section 7 have carried on? For as long as possible, but probably not very long. But we know virtually nothing. And what I'm hoping the book will do is we'll have lots more people come through of giving us their stories. And most of it now is obviously second-hand stories through relatives, and you obviously have to take everything with a slight pinch of salt from that respect. But I had 3 or 4 families contact me saying my granddad was a young teenager during the war. He was taught how to use a sniper rifle with a .22 sniper rifle, and people, a family from Liverpool, a family from Nottingham, a family from Leicester, and a family from Southampton, all told me the exact same story independently. That these young boys, were taught they all used very similar terminology. The most terrifying ex-NCO First World War veterans, how to use a sniper rifle. So it sounds like the SIS were recruiting sharpshooters from the First World War, bringing them in and teaching 13, 14, 15-year-old kids how to be assassins in the event of a German occupation. It's the most remarkable story that's still unheard of, really.
It's incredible. And I think most remarkable of all is the fact that this was officially the accountancy arm of SIS. I think they probably chose the most boring people. Apologies to any accountants this evening. Well, look, to wrap up, I just want to ask you very briefly about how important these people were in the grand scheme of Britain's war. I think it's something that we in Britain in many ways take for granted. As bad as the bombing of Britain was, as bad as the privations of the civilian population and the traumas that we experienced here, British people never experienced occupation. And it's why in fiction, things like SSGB by Len Deighton, Fatherland by Robert Harris, the counterfactual that the Germans invade and are successful is one that I think is particularly horrific for us. And I was struck by the detail in your book that the Defence Medal was never given to any of these people. There was a lapel badge.
Yeah.
So how important were they? And more than that, I guess, how should we commemorate and remember their efforts in the end that were preparing for something that didn't happen?
I think they're important. I kind of touched on it briefly before. They're important in the fact that they helped to shape what resistance in occupied Europe might look like. And it helped shape what irregular forces were capable of and in terms of training. In terms of, they got a stand-down letter, both the Special Duties Branch and the auxiliary units, which basically said, from GHQ Home Forces, thanks for your service, you're not going to get any public recognition. That was it. And they got the auxiliary units got a small lapel badge, and that was it. I was speaking to Ken Welch, the Cornish vet. He said he wore his lapel badge all the time in the kind of 50s, and he went to an event at a hotel, and as he said, he went to Point Percy at the Porcelain, and another chap stood next to him, and he also had the lapel badge in. They didn't say anything, they kind of nodded at each other, and then went their separate ways. But and they all took, incredibly secret. But that's the only recognition they got. And I think we have, since the end of the war, and Dad's Army, which is brilliant, hasn't helped. But we have this weird pride in Britain's defences being Corporal Jones and Captain Mannering, and us being slightly British about it, about not very well prepared. Maybe it's just sitting back having a cup of tea, waiting for the invasion to happen, and we'll sort ourselves out. I think there should be a new pride in the fact that there were 6,500 highly trained guerrilla and saboteurs in underground bunkers waiting for the German invasion. At least 4,000 special duties branch operatives, ranging from old women to teenagers, ready to spy on the German army and to give up-to-date, relevant, timely information to high command. And even a post-occupation force made up of God knows how many thousands of people who were ready there only at the point of occupation to make life as difficult as possible for the occupying forces, to get people who are under threat from the occupying forces away. That should be our pride. It shouldn't be this narrative of Corporal Jones waiting on the cliff with a pitchfork. Actually, we were going to be utterly ruthless in the execution of the defence of this country. And these are just normal civilians. There's nothing to say of the regular army themselves. These are just normal civilians who, at the end of the war, stand down. Special Duties Branch stood down July 44. Auxiliaries November 44. Just went back to their normal lives. And God knows how many Section 7 people just went back to their normal lives and said nothing to anyone. As I said, 85% of them said nothing to anyone. We're still telling people now that actually your granddad, your father, wasn't just in the Home Guard. Actually, he was a highly trained guerrilla saboteur, which we have to sit down with the more elderly people to tell them that. But yeah, that should be our pride. That should be their place. And it should be, I've been doing this for 13 years, and every time I speak to someone about it, they have no idea about this. And I feel like part of the book is to try and get it out there that actually these guys need the recognition. It's too late for most of them, but actually these guys need the recognition that what they were prepared to do for the country in its darkest hour.